Well, hey, what's up, everybody? Pastor Matt here. Thanks for checking into the YouTube channel. Hey, today we're going to take on a really good viewer question that comes from a friend called Sophia. So let's go ahead and put her question up here on the board. Now, Sophia is one of my very rare female viewers. My audience is 83% men. 83% of those men have beards and pulpits, and so I love it when I get a question from a woman, so this is great. Sophia is a college student studying engineering, and she says she loves studying Reformed theology in her spare time, and her question has to do with the frequency of the celebration of the Lord's Supper. It's a great question because she says she's thinking about what church to be a part of. Again, I commend her for that. She's wondering about our practice at Gospel Fellowship PCA, as well as what is the Reformed practice in history in relation to the celebrating of the Lord's Supper. How often should we do these things? All right. So, Sophia, thanks again for this question. We're going to get right into it and try to answer that question as helpfully as we possibly can here. So, let me start off by saying that there is some bit of variance in the Reformed tradition on how often to come to the table. What I'm going to show you in this video is that we have everything from arguments of very frequently coming to the table, as for instance with Calvin, we're going to see him arguing for that. And we have some churches that celebrate the Lord's Supper very infrequently. On the far extreme, the Free Church of Scotland, which celebrates the Lord's Supper only once a year. Now, it would be very easy to simply say something like this, that, well, we do what we do because we hold the Lord's Supper in a high view, and other people that disagree with us, they have a low view of the Lord's Supper. But that's not necessarily true. In fact, we're not really in this video even discussing the meaning of the Lord's Supper as much as we are the practical matter of how often the church should celebrate the supper. So let's go ahead and look at the dodgeball teams here. If we're going to draft teams here, we're going to have a little fantasy league. Who is in what camp? Well, in favor of weekly communion, you'd have your stalwarts like Martin Luther, you'd have Butzer, you'd have Calvin preferred. We're going to come back to that in a little bit. Cranmer as well would be in favor of weekly Lord's Supper. And then with something less frequent than that, either monthly or every 8 weeks or quarterly, you'd have Zwingli, Bullinger, Knox, and Jonathan Edwards. And then to the other side of that pendulum, we'll have the Free Church of Scotland, which, as I mentioned, comes to the Lord's table, but only once a year. So let's start with John Calvin. Now, I've got Augustine up on the board, and that's because Calvin actually cites Augustine in defense of Calvin's preferred frequency, which would be weekly coming to the Lord's table. Now, just a little bit of background about Calvin. He did not get his way, which is why we had a little asterisk there next to his name. Calvin wanted to have the Lord's Supper every week, but unfortunately, there were the powers that be, the church consistory and the town council. There was a lot of pulling and tension about some of these things. Calvin got his way a lot of times when it came to the reforms of doctrine and practice, but there were some things that he had to give and take a little bit on. And this is one of those areas where Calvin actually didn't get his way. So in the Institutes, he cites and quotes St. Augustine in a couple of different places in defense of his preference for frequency. So let's look back all the way to Augustine as we're establishing the Reformed tradition here. The sacrament of the unity of our Lord's body is in some places provided daily, and in others at certain intervals at the Lord's table. And at that table, some partake to life and others to destruction. Okay, so that's from Tractate 26. And again, Calvin is quoting this in his Institutes, Book 4, Chapter 17, paragraph 45. He says again here, Calvin quoting Augustine, some communicate daily in the body and blood of the Lord. Others receive it on certain days in some places. Not a day intervenes in which it is not offered. In others, it's offered only on the Sabbath and the Lord's Day. In others, on the Lord's Day only. Okay, so a lot of variance happening in Augustine's time. Augustine says here that sometimes it's just the Lord's Day, sometimes it's Saturday and Sunday, and in other places it's different days of the week, so that you can practically come to the Lord's table on almost any day. And again, Calvin looks on this very favorably because he's going to be arguing for a frequency model of coming to the Lord's table quite often. So Calvin cites Augustine in defense of his own preference. Now, in terms of a weekly position here, you've got Martin Luther, you've got Cranmer, you've got Butzer, and you've got John Calvin. Luther, of course, would celebrate the Lord's Supper every single Lord's Day. And by the way, if you're wondering where I get this information from, there's a really good book I've been citing lately called Reformation Worship. I believe it's Ernge and Gibson, if I'm not mistaken. I might be mistaken on that, but I'll post a link to that book in the description of this video. This is where we can read about a lot of the patterns of these reformers and what they did during their times of worship. Okay, so I'm just going to reference that book here as I'm getting a lot of my information from that particular textbook. Zwingli, he preferred to have the Lord's Supper 4 times a year, and he would celebrate the Lord's Supper at Easter, Pentecost, All Saints' Day, and Christmas. Now, he actually says autumn, but it was probably meant All Saints' Day there because that would make a nice 4 times a year model. So a little bit of a church calendar model happening here with Ulrich Zwingli. And Bullinger does something quite similar to that, also Easter, Pentecost, All Saints' Day, and Christmas. But Bullinger would add something that kind of becomes part of the Reformed tradition here, and that would be special preparatory sermons or services in advance of the coming to the table at those times. So even though it would be less frequently than, for instance, John Calvin would have preferred, nevertheless, there was some extra preparation that went before those services in which communion was offered. Again, we're going to see that coming up here a little bit later. Now let's go back to John Calvin, because he's probably the champion of frequent communion, and he has much to say about this. Again, Institutes, Book 4, Chapter 17, Paragraph 44, and so a long chapter in the Institutes. Calvin says this, and this is going to be his theological defense for frequency. He says, quote, "What we have hitherto said of the sacrament abundantly shows that it was not instituted to be received once a year, and that perfunctorily, as is now commonly the custom," little dig there, certainly a barb, "but that all Christians might have it in frequent use, and frequently call to mind the sufferings of Christ, thereby sustaining and confirming their faith, stirring themselves up to sing the praises of God, and proclaim his goodness, cherishing and testifying towards each other that mutual charity, the bond of which they see in the unity of the body of Christ." Okay, so all of the foregoing sections in the Institutes, as Calvin is describing the meaning and of importance of the Lord's Supper, are kind of summarized here. And Calvin says it's because of the depth and the richness and the beauty of the supper that we should desire to celebrate it frequently. In fact, he cites here that it helps us to contemplate the sufferings of Christ as the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus are celebrated in the supper, as well as the proclaimed, preached word, of course, but visually and gloriously depicted in the Lord's Supper. Not only that, but it stirs up our hearts to be thankful and to praise God. And not only that, but it also unifies us and bonds us together as believers. This is the moment where our unity as the church is visually displayed and experienced together. So Calvin says all this is great, all the more reason that we should come to the Lord's table with some frequency. Now, Calvin is also going to argue a biblical and historical defense of his position. It's not merely theological, but he thinks that there's precedent in the Holy Scriptures for coming to the table quite regularly. He says this, quoting again from the Institutes, "That such was the practice of the Apostolic Church, we are informed by Luke in the Acts, when he says that they continued steadfastly in the apostles' doctrine and fellowship, and in breaking of bread and in prayers. Thus, we ought always to provide that no meeting of the church is held without the word, prayer, and the dispensation of the supper and alms. We may gather from Paul that this was the order observed by the Corinthians, and it is certain that this was the practice of many ages after." So notice that Calvin is going to defend this position by citing Acts chapter 2, verse 42. Now, that's a little bit controversial. I'm just going to tell you that right now, because he is interpreting the line, the breaking of bread and of the prayers, as pertaining to the Lord's Supper. But in the 1st century AD, the idea of the breaking of bread does sometimes mean a common or ordinary meal. It does not necessarily mean the sacramental meal of the Lord's Supper. But Calvin takes it that way in his defense here. And he also buttresses that argument by citing Paul in 1 Corinthians. The pertinent chapters would be chapter 10 and chapter 11. That he seems to be gathering from this that the Corinthians are supposed to celebrate the Lord's Supper quite frequently. Then Calvin mentions the practices of ages thereafter, indicating that he thinks that this is the early apostolic and historical position of the churches. Now, you ready for some interesting John Calvin here? Here he gets a little bit spicy, okay? Spicy Calvin quote coming. "Most assuredly, The custom, which prescribes communion once a year, is an invention of the devil, by what instrumentality soever it may have been introduced. Okay, so do you think Calvin has some strong feelings on frequency? He certainly does. And what's interesting here is that, remember, the Institutes came out in multiple iterations. He didn't just write it one time. It started off as a short book, and then it grew, and then it grew, and then the French, and then the Latin. The French and the Latin editions came out all the way to the 1559. He leaves this in for all of his opponents in the consistory or the town council who were arguing otherwise. This is a clear dig and a barb against anyone who would hold something counter to his position here. He thinks it's of the devil. Now, you can almost imagine the Scottish Presbyterians that we're going to talk about later on, who were later than Calvin here, looking back to this paragraph of the Institutes. They love the book, The Institutes, no question about that, but this paragraph was probably not their favorite, and you can see why this might get some feathers raised a little bit here, quoting Calvin's strong position on this topic. He says this: each week at least the table of the Lord ought to have been spread for the company of Christians, and the promises declared on which we might then spiritually feed. Here we see that Calvin would actually be inclined to celebrate even more frequently than just once a week. He might actually be in favor of something like Augustine is describing, where the Lord's Supper is very commonly available to believers. Okay? Well, what about the Westminster Assembly? If we're going to do a history of the Reformed practice, we should definitely look at the Westminster Divines here, as that's kind of the high water mark of Reformed theology and practice. Now, the Westminster Assembly, remember, this is a large committee, so there's going to be a variance of opinion. Sometimes people think that the Westminster Divines had just sat down and wrote out the thing without any debate. No, lots of debate, and you had all kinds of different positions here. And I'm citing here Beeke and Jones in their book Puritan Theology, page 751, in which they say that the general trend was that the independents at the assembly favored a weekly communion, whereas the Presbyterians favored something more like a quarterly participation in the Lord's Supper. Okay? So I trust that Beeke and Jones did the research and consulted Chad Van Dixhorn, who's sort of the expert in the underlying argumentation of the Westminster Assembly. He's probably the best scholar in the world on that particular topic, so I'm just trusting that Beeke and Jones did their homework when they say that. But the point being this, that there wasn't one consensus on this, but rather that there was debate on this particular topic. And so, when the Westminster Assembly hammered out the Directory of Public Worship, here's what they said, in kind of a compromising mode here. You're going to notice a little bit of compromise in the tone here. Now, before I read this, I just want to remind you that the Westminster Assembly, not only did they formulate a confession of faith and a larger catechism and a shorter catechism, but also they hammered out a directory of public worship. This is the least known document of the Westminster Divines, and it's probably because it's been supplanted by modern books of church order. For instance, in the PCA, we have our BCO, our Book of Church Order, and all Presbyterian denominations have something similar to that. So too the RPCNA and others of our friends in the Reformed tradition. But the Directory of Public Worship was kind of the original one, and each denomination eventually kind of expanded it as their needs required. But nevertheless, we point back to this document here, quoting, "The communion or supper of the Lord is frequently to be celebrated, but how often may be considered and determined by ministers and other church governors of each congregation, as they shall find most convenient for the comfort and edification of the people committed to their charge. And when it shall be administered, we judge it convenient to be done after the morning sermon." Okay? Couple things interesting here. First, the reference to the morning sermon seems to imply that there was also an expected evening service. But not only that, but what we see here is kind of a position of compromise in which the divines essentially say the elders and pastors of each church should decide what is appropriate for their own congregation without writing down any firm lines drawn in the sand. Okay? Now let's go on with this document here. The Westminster Directory continues to say, "Where the sacrament cannot be with convenience frequently administered, it is requisite that public warning be given the Sabbath day before the administration thereof, and that either then or on some day of that week, something concerning that ordinance in the due preparation thereunto, and participation thereof be taught, that by the diligent use of all means sanctified of God to that end, both in public and private, all may come better prepared to that heavenly feast." So, point being, if you're going to celebrate the Lord's Supper less frequently, with more space in between, then you should do more work to prepare the heart before coming to the table. Remember Bullinger's model of having the Lord's Supper 4 times a year, but having special services and sermons to prepare the people for the sake of the communion meal. Okay, now let's go to Jonathan Edwards, of course. What video would be good without a little reference to Jonathan Edwards? Yes. Edwards now talks a lot about communion. In fact, he was deposed from his pulpit in the Northampton church because of his stand on the Lord's Supper. But it didn't have to do with the frequency of coming to the table. It had rather to do with who was permitted to come to the table. And so in his controversial writings, of course, he writes a lot about the Lord's Supper, but mostly he's arguing his position about the fencing of the table, not how often the table should be observed. But we notice here in this very important document from the times of the Great Awakening, actually the local revival, 1735, preceding the Great Awakening, 1740, Edwards says this in his book, A Faithful Narrative. Quote, "We have about 620 communicants, which include almost all of our adult persons. The church was very large before, but persons never thronged into it as they did in the late extraordinary time. Our sacraments are 8 weeks asunder, and I received into the communion about 100 before one sacrament, and 80 of them at one time, whose appearance, when they presented themselves together to make an open, explicit profession of Christianity, was very affecting to the congregation. I took in nearly 60 before the next sacrament day." Now, in context here, Edwards is rejoicing in the fact that people are getting saved in the Northampton area and coming from membership to the church and applying for admittance to the Lord's table. But what he says here, as he's describing the glorious rejoicings of the time of the awakening, is that his church celebrates the Lord's Supper every 8 weeks. And that gives the church time to not only to prepare the people to come, but also to interview those people that may like to join the church, confess and profess their faith, and come to the Lord's table perhaps for the very first time in their lives. Okay, so we see that from Edwards. Now, let's go to the opposite extreme here and look at the Free Church of Scotland. This is going to be interesting to some of you because if you're not from this tradition, you might not understand this. But this is actually from their website today. Okay, so this is their current position on frequency. Quoting, "All congregations of the Free Presbyterian Church continue to hold communion services every time the Lord's Supper is administered. With preparatory services on Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, the Lord's Supper is dispensed on the Lord's Day, followed by a Thanksgiving service or services on Monday." Okay, now here's with the frequency of holding the Lord's Supper. In each congregation, the supper is dispensed only once or twice each year. Compared with most churches today, this is relatively infrequent. Well, I would say so. It is not because the supper is undervalued, but because it is rightly and scripturally valued that the supper is not held more frequently. So here, okay, it's not because they have a low view of the Lord's Supper that they come only once a year. In fact, what you're going to see next is how diligently they spend time to prepare the heart for coming to the communion moment. So this is summarized from an article by David Murray here, explaining why they come once or twice a year. One reason is, of course, the seriousness of coming to the Lord's table. Another reason might be a little bit more practical, that in times past, perhaps ministers were not available, and they, of course, have the communion service administered by licensed, ordained ministers. And so if you don't have enough ministers to go to every church, well, of course, that's going to argue for infrequency. But look at what they do here the week of the Lord's Supper. They spend a whole week, really, preparing for this. Thursday, they would have a sermon of humiliation in which the church was exhorted to fast. Now, let me just pause there and ask you, does your church fast at all, or especially before the Lord's Supper? Okay, well, they do. They started on Thursday. Friday, they would have 2 sermons usually focusing on self-examination. Self-examination being that great Puritan application to most sermons in which we should really dig into our own heart to find what's in there, repent of it, confess it, mortify it, and to pray that God would help us in our walk of faithfulness to Christ. Saturday would be a day of preparation in the giving out of the token. Now, this is going to be totally new for a lot of you, and you're going to maybe freak out a little bit here. But they would come to their elders and their pastors, having gone through these preparatory moments, and the elders would actually give them the communion token. Now, I'm told that this is also done in certain Dutch Reformed churches as well, but that token would symbolize that the person is a member of the church in good standing with a right and moral life, and has been interviewed to essentially express the fact that they're ready to come to the table. So when they would come to the table on Sunday, the Lord's Day, the communicant would then present that token to the pastors or the elders, and thereby they would prevent people who had not done their readiness or come to the church even for membership from coming to the table. That's the fencing of the table. That's the way they would do it, with this communion token. So the communion would be celebrated on the Lord's Day, and then you think it's all over, right? No, well, because on Monday they would have another service of celebration, which they would give thanks and praise for all that God has done. Now, when you look at that, it's pretty hard to argue that they have the Lord's Supper infrequently because they have a low view of the Lord's Supper. In fact, that cannot be the case. It's because they have a high view of the supper. So isn't that interesting that those like Calvin arguing for very regularly, and those who have the Lord's Supper quite irregularly, are both striking out their positions because they believe they're doing what's best to honor the Lord's Supper and to come in a worthy and ready manner to it. Okay, so I think, going back to Sophia's question, that there should be some great manner of charity in our hearts as we consider these things. And there's probably a pretty good reason that churches do what they do. All right, well, I hope that this has been an informative video to you and maybe helped you to understand a little bit of the historical position of the Reformed churches better. Thank you so much for checking into this particular video. Do love you lots, and we'll talk to you later.